Hello, my name is Karina Gavinji and I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion across EMEA. I'm so excited to be here as part of our I Am Remarkable week. And I Am Remarkable is a Google initiative that empowers everyone, particularly women and underrepresented groups, to celebrate their achievements in the workplace and beyond. To date, the program has reached over 150,000 participants across 140 countries and 800 companies and growing. And this is our first global I Am Remarkable week, which aims to emphasize the power of workplace diversity and allyship while encouraging everyone to celebrate their achievements. I am so pleased to introduce John Amaechi for today's talk. John is a respected organizational psychologist, a best-selling New York Times author, and CEO of Amaechi Performance Systems. Before I hand over to John, just to let you know, we're going to be taking live Q&A later, so please make sure that you add your questions throughout the session. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Karina. Much appreciated. And hello, everybody. Again, just to re-emphasize the fact that we will be taking those questions, those live questions, so please do contribute. I'd love to hear from you. So just a quick introduction. I am a psychologist. I'm a geek and a nerd. You will notice from my tchotchkes over here, I'm a geek and a nerd. I'm also a director of the UK's largest hospital trust. And I sit on the board with a bunch of other colleagues, and I do strategic work and none of the really important stuff that most of our colleagues do. Over the course of the last 6 or 7 months, you can imagine the stress that my colleagues have been under. And one of the things that we started to understand, I think, in a way that perhaps none of us appreciated before, is that we have to care about each other. Even as colleagues, we have to care about each other. It's not about friendship. It's about an authentic connection to other people. And so I've been starting off everything I've been doing by saying this: I hope you're okay. I know that for many of you, you will be wonderfully resilient, and all of this happening around you will be water off a duck's back. Others of you will have been wounded by loss, anxious, afraid. There's financial and health insecurity out there. And I just need you to know that if you're not okay, that's really normal. Nothing drastic is required from you in order to get through this, except for connecting to people who matter to you. I know that you're coping. I know that you're going to be going about your business, doing your work and whatever else, but I just want to say, I know that it's difficult because I feel it. I would never claim to be the most resilient of people, but I feel it. And so I know some of you must be too. This is not the destination. We're not through it yet, but this is not the destination, and we will be fine. I'm going to talk for about 35, 40 minutes, and then I'm going to look for your comments and your questions, and I really want to hear from you. Don't wait until I stop talking to throw something down. Give me your insights, put your questions in there so that the moment that I do shut up, I'll be able to immediately start addressing your questions. Don't worry about not having the right words. Half the time I don't have the right words, and you just have to dive in. There's no judgment here. We're allowed to be a little bit clumsy while we learn. We're allowed to be a little bit clumsy while we try and understand something better. I'm a psychologist by trade, and people often don't think that psychologists are scientists, but we are. We're evidence-based practitioners. And so what I'm going to try and talk to you about today with regard to imposter syndrome is some of the things that I have learned over the years, and it's going to be a mixture of some storytelling because it's what I like to do, and it's going to be a mixture of some science, and hopefully it'll be useful to you. But I want to hear from you what you really want to know about as we go along. Imposter syndrome is a huge subject. Lots of people talk about it. Some of you, many of you, will have been subject to it. I know I am, on a daily basis. It's variously described as kind of referring to an internal experience of believing that you're not as competent as others perceive you to be. That sense of being a phony, being a fraud. You feel as though any moment you're going to be found out. That idea that you feel like you don't really belong, and any second now, somebody's going to realize it. The really tough thing about imposter syndrome is that it persists even when you achieve, even when you do really well. You still have that looming sense. But it's important that we recognize a few things. One, suffering from imposter syndrome doesn't mean that you have low self-esteem. It doesn't mean that you have no confidence. Just because you doubt your abilities from time to time, this is also important. Just because you do doubt your abilities from time, that also doesn't mean you have imposter syndrome, because it's really normal. We live in this weird world where everybody says that actually the default state we should all be in is no doubt. I would encourage us to look around and look where that's got us. People with varying levels of skills who operate on a theory that they have no failings and no doubt. That is not a route to the future as far as I'm concerned. Just because you've achieved success, even against the odds, it doesn't mean that you won't suffer from imposter syndrome, or that you didn't suffer from imposter syndrome at one period, especially if you are a non-typical person, which is why we're here today. That's why I Am Remarkable is here, to help people who perhaps aren't the archetypes of talent that some people have in mind. Imposter syndrome strikes those who are achievers and those who want to achieve. It strikes people who really care about being good at what they do. It strikes people for whom being really competent in certain areas really matters to them. In other words, it's really unfortunate because imposter syndrome strikes exactly the people that most organizations want, and even if they don't want, need to be there. And in a way, it's related to stereotype threat. And I don't know if you've heard of that, but this is not my work. This is the work of a remarkable psychologist called Claude Steele. He's a professor at Stanford University. Stereotype threat is the idea that if you're trying to perform in an area where you or the group that you belong to is negatively stereotyped. So, for example, if you're an engineer, if you're in engineering and you're a woman, you're in technology and you're a woman, lots of different places where the archetype of who's supposed to be talent in that area is not you, you will feel a distracting pressure that will inhibit your performance. And not only that, it'll diminish your pleasure in achievement, and it'll make you tangibly worse at what you do. I think one of the cruelest parts of imposter syndrome and indeed stereotype threat is that what makes you susceptible to these things is being different than the archetype of your context, being different than the thing that you're supposed to be in your environment, and caring about doing what you do well. Literally, if you are, for example, a woman in engineering who doesn't really care, we've seen this in students. They've actually done this study. Claude Steele did this study with women taking maths tests, girls taking maths tests in school. The girls who cared about doing really well on the maths test really suffered from that stereotype threat, that imposter syndrome. It made them worse at their results. The girls who didn't care, they did exactly as they were predicted to do. That imposter syndrome, that stereotype threat, they're not quite the same thing, but they're very similar. Had that impact. If you really, if you're interested in this subject, and certainly in Claude Steele's work, I'd encourage you to read his book. It's called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele, S-T-E-E-L-E. He is remarkable, and the book is brilliant and very readable. In the book, it's called Whistling Vivaldi because he talks about a black man who spends some of his time going to work, walking through a wealthy neighborhood in Chicago. And as he does so, he feels the burning pressure of people around him looking at him, judging him, perhaps thinking he's going to do something criminal, which is what happens when walking whilst black. And he thought of this strategy to help other people feel more at ease and to help them to think that he might fit in. And this strategy was that as he walked, he whistled Vivaldi, classical music, Baroque classical music. And it's not that the people around him knew that it was Baroque classical music, but what they knew was that it was classical music. And if he's whistling classical music, he must be one of the good ones. That man is now on the editorial staff of the New York Times. He's a man called Brent Staples. But remarkable the strategies that we have to use to get away from imposter syndrome. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about for the next while. Some of the strategies that I use to this day, and some of the insights that I've gained from talking to better psychologists than me. The first of those that you need to know is this. It is not accidental that you feel imposter syndrome. You're supposed to. I went to a British Psychological Society conference. It must have been 4 or 5 years ago now. And I wish I had written down her name, but I was so busy writing down what this woman said, this professor said, that I didn't get her name. But she said, imposter syndrome is not an individual pathology. It's exactly how the system wants you to feel. Note that the system doesn't make everybody feel this way, but many of you who suffer imposter syndrome, in your head, you will be sure that it's about you, that something is broken in you, that something is not right about you. And whilst I can't say that there's nothing wrong with you, because there's loads wrong with me, I'm a weird, wonderful person, and you, I hope, are a bit weird and wonderful too. But imposter syndrome doesn't exist because you're broken. It's not an individual pathology. Imposter syndrome is one of the ways that the status quo is maintained. Before you think I'm getting on some kind of Marxist tip, I'm not. It's simply that systems are very averse to change on their own, and they do find ways to stop it from happening. And so when you think of workplaces, you think of how they started, you think of an insurance company, you think even of tech companies, which we think of as more progressive, but aren't necessarily, in terms of their approach to talent. There's somebody in mind when you think of coder, programmer. There's somebody in mind when you think of insurance broker. There's a person, an archetype, a type of person. They have characteristics. Are they a white man who's middle class? Have they gone to one of 16 universities in the United Kingdom, at least? That archetype is what that system has in mind. And so it often responds to try and keep it that way. And one of the ways it does that is by every degree of difference that you are from that archetype, you feel slightly more friction than somebody else who fits that system. And this is true of lots of different types of people. So I know that many of you might be thinking I'm talking just about protected categories. You know, those categories that are protected by law. I'm just talking about women or people with disabilities, LGBTQ, black and brown people, but that's not what I'm talking about. It is including them, but it's also that sensitive and introverted straight white man. The truth is, imposter syndrome is coming for you too. The extroverted person in a classically introverted environment, we work in some deep science background in environments where the kind of default state that you're supposed to have is to be a classic introvert who never interacts with other people, and extroverts have a sense of imposter syndrome there. This is encouraged by the way we assess people, by the way, using straight white 50-year-old American executives or 18-year-old college students as our norm group will make many of us, American or not, young or old, black or white, feel like we aren't the type of person who should progress, the kind of person who should be around. Ironically, with the landscape shifting as we know it is doing right now, we know people in high school now are preparing, to a greater or lesser extent, for jobs that don't even exist now. The world is changing so rapidly now that when you look around, McKinsey's latest research on the future of work tells us that between now and 2030, somewhere between 75 and 375 million workers will be switching their occupational categories. Imposter syndrome is getting rid of the very people who will have those diverse perspectives and want to engage with their difference and their uniqueness to make the future world of work one that thrives. My company has a sign that hangs on our wall in our office, and it says weird and wonderful. And I think it's time for organizations to recognize what got us here in terms of talent and people will not get us there. Those of you who are weird and wonderful, welcome. The future is weird and wonderful too. When environments make you feel like you don't belong, it will exacerbate imposter syndrome and indeed stereotype threat, with all the associated impacts on performance, right? Each of you will feel less able to deliver because you have this uncertainty, you have this worry that any second you'll be found out. Research has identified that high achievers in workplaces, we talk to people who were actually mostly white, mostly men, mostly straight, right? Because that's what most organizations identify as high achievers in their workplace, even now. So we talk to them about how included they felt, because when you feel more included, it takes the edge off. It doesn't remove, but it takes the edge off. It's one of the things that takes the edge off imposter syndrome, and that's one of the things that organizations can really do. But we asked a group of high achievers, and again, mostly white, mostly men, mostly straight, how they feel, how included they felt. We asked them on a scale of 1 to 7. 1 is totally excluded. They absolutely didn't fit. They didn't belong. 7 was totally included. The person would say, I feel absolutely that I belong. And I pinned 4 in the middle. It's arbitrary, but I put 4 in the middle, and I said 4 to those people who answered. 4 means compliance. Nobody's doing anything illegal to you. I know many people would imagine that with a group of mostly straight white men, almost everybody was burying the needle in 7. Everybody's totally fit. And what we found, and it shouldn't be surprising because we know just being straight and white and a male doesn't necessarily make you not diverse. You've got lots of things that make you diverse. That the average for that group was actually 5. 1 point above compliance. 1 point above no one's doing anything illegal to me. Inclusion benefits everybody, but that just shows you how many of that group might have been experiencing imposter syndrome, that sense of doubt and worry, that sense of being a fraud in the midst. What's interesting is that when we did that study, we asked, it was about 2,074 respondents in that study. We also asked them one additional question on that same scale. 1, totally excluded. 7, totally fit. 4, nobody's doing anything illegal to me. We asked that same group on the second one, what do you think the experience is of people who are more diverse than you? And this could mean anything. A white person might have thought of a black person. A man might have thought of a woman. Lots of people could have thought of lots of things. A person without a disability could have thought of somebody with a disability. But just the question was somebody more diverse than you. What do you think their experience of inclusion is? And as I said, the score for that group of mostly straight white men was 5, 1 point above compliance. The score that they put for people who are more diverse, the average was 4. Compliance. No one's doing anything illegal to me. Of that group, only 19% of that 2,074 people reported that they felt fully included. We've got work to do in our workplaces if we want people to really be able to imagine themselves. And if we want to help people manage that imposter syndrome that they feel, that you feel, that we feel. I wanted to talk to you about some of the things that I think we don't consider. I became a psychologist. It's a long story and I'm not going to tell you right now, but I became a psychologist because I thought my mother was magic. My mother was a doctor. And I watched how she interacted with patients, and I realized even as a 7-year-old, that how she interacted with patients, it wasn't about the medicine, that she was doing something magic with them. And because this was when I was 7 years old, which was in 1977, quite some time ago, that was when the film Star Wars came out, which is why you can see all the Star Wars stuff behind me. And I thought the magic that my mother had was being a Jedi. And so when I looked around at jobs, when I was 7 and 11 and then 18 and then even older, I realized the closest thing I could find to what I saw my mother do, that ability to transform people with your words, is becoming a psychologist. Many people think that psychologists get some magic training that makes us psychologists, and I don't think so. I think all of us have an ability to influence other people, and we underestimate it. We have an ability to influence other people's very identity. You've got to embrace the power of people who mean something to you and remember your own power to influence others, because every single time you have an interaction with somebody else, you tell them something about them. I'm not suggesting for a second that the way you look at somebody can make them black or a woman or LGBT or white or anything else, but it can dictate how you feel about being those things. If you're a person with a stutter, how someone looks at you, conflating your stutter with somehow a lack of intelligence, that can tell you that you're stupid. When people cross the street, when I approach them in public, cross away, I know it's because they look at me and they think I'm a monster. And if you're not careful, that can seep into your very soul. There are people in this room who know that they've been profoundly impacted by a random look from a senior person. Sometimes for days, it's rolled around in your head and made you question who you are, your capability, your ambition, your potential. And there are others in this room who will know that they can profoundly impact others with one of those looks. Our identity, how we feel about ourselves, is not something that just grows inside us like a sapling to an oak. That's not how it works. Our identity is made up of how we see ourselves reflected in the faces of the people around us. We've known this for a long time. 1902, a psychologist called Charles Cooley came up with something called the looking glass self, a theory so old that it was before mirrors were called mirrors, looking glasses, as in Alice Through the Looking Glass, the book. The looking glass self tells us that our identity is actually made up of a collage of all the faces we see. And some of you are subjected to faces that make you doubt yourself. We have to avoid that. And it's hard in an environment where people don't realize the impact they can have. It's not just about your title. Yep, if you are a senior person, your mirror will be much bigger than the other person. But every single person contributes to the picture we have of ourselves, whether we are something special, something with potential, or something average, something with no capability. Just to illustrate this, when I was 11 years old, I knew exactly who I was. I grew up in Stockport in the north of England. Nobody cares. And I used to go on holiday with my two sisters and my mum, and we'd go to a caravan, a friend's caravan in Wales, in Rhyl. And it was August, and so of course it was raining, and I would love it because we would sit there together in the end of the caravan reading books. And every once in a while, I would be reading Asimov or something else equally geeky. And every once in a while, I would look up from my book and I would see my mother looking at me. And in that moment, I knew exactly who I was because the look on her face told me that I was her clever boy. And that's who I knew I was. Unfortunately, in my 11th year, I went to secondary school and 12th year, went to secondary school, and I found out that my mother had lied to me. My first day of school, a man approached me. He was the rugby teacher. And he grabbed me by the arm and said, "Of course you'll play rugby." And I looked at him and in my head, I was like, why would I do something that might cause a brain injury? I'm the clever boy. But it became increasingly clear that nobody could see that I was the clever boy. I read a book my first year in secondary school that told me exactly who I was. The book was The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The monster in that book, which ironically is the only one who isn't monstrous, People laugh at the monster and point. They're afraid of the monster and they think the monster's stupid. And I realized very quickly that those three things are what people think of me. Our impact as individuals on other people is massive. Your imposter syndrome is not a personal weakness, but who in your life might be contributing to it with the way that they look at you. You can't do something about everybody in your life. You'll have bosses and colleagues who you can't just get rid of. But where are you looking for the real reflection of you? Who can you find that when they look at you, and this is not about sycophancy, right? This is not about saying, oh yeah, you're amazing, you can do anything. No, this is about just reflecting back your potential and then holding you to it. Who are you going to find? Many of you with imposter syndrome have found one person, and it's that little voice in your head, characterized by a bunch of questions and assertions. I feel like a fake. I'll probably screw this up. You're no good at this anyway. It's all down to luck. You won't enjoy it even if you win. This voice, it assaults us in our own head. Tells us that we're terrible, tells us that we're frauds. It feels exactly like there's somebody in there trapped talking to us sometimes. And actually, in medieval times, people thought there was a man in our head driving us. Of course, it was a man, but a man in our head driving us. They called it homunculus because they recognized that there is that voice in your head that sometimes talks to you and you sometimes talk to it. And so they thought there's probably a man in there driving human beings. The thing that you have to do with that voice in your head is you have to challenge it with your true voice. And I know that sounds like odd advice. There's lots of jokes we could make about voices in our heads, but fundamentally we know that we have that self-talk. And those of us with imposter syndrome know that that self-talk is really a challenge for us. But we have to really look at it in a different way. Instead of trying to ignore it, which is always impossible to do, it just ends up being this background noise that distracts at every turn. We've got to face it. And we've got to face this. Each of you wouldn't let your best friend, your parent, or your partner talk to you like your voice in your head does. And more than that, each of you knows that your best friend, partner, or parent wouldn't be much of a good person if they did talk to you in the same way that that voice in your head does. This voice is not something broken in you. This is a manifestation of doubt and misery, stereotyping, all kinds of other stuff that talks to you this way. And we have to train it. I'm not suggesting for a second that we shouldn't be the kind of people who really have an honest critique of ourselves. I do it on a reasonably regular basis. I encourage my team and my friends to do it too. A proper critique helps you grow, but it's got to be done in a way that provides us insights. It's got to be a way that's designed to develop and produce results. That's what feedback is. Just saying stuff that you notice is not feedback. We've got to make sure that we challenge that voice. And there's a number of ways we can do this. I'm going to give you a couple of things that you can do to challenge the voice. I hope this is useful. And then if you want to do a proper critique of your performance or your process or your plan, some questions that you can ask there that I think would be more useful, a process that you could follow. So when that voice in your head is yelling at you, telling you that you're ugly and that you're terrible and that you're lucky, and then anything else that it tells you to undermine you, you can ask it a few questions. These are just a few of the ones that I use on a regular basis. Is it real? What you're saying, is it real? You've just said, I'm a terrible person, I've got no chance of succeeding. Is that real? Is that verifiably accurate? Or is that just the kind of heckling from the crowd? And if it's just heckling from the crowd with no substance, you toss it out. And I know that's easier said than done. Sometimes we can be especially cruel to us in our heads. This is a good one. Is it shared? So when even that, sometimes that critique in your head is quite specific. Oh, you were never any good at X. Is it a shared idea? Is that sentiment shared? Or do you know other people in your circle who tell you the opposite? Actually, you may not have performed up to your standards on this particular occasion, but normally you are good at X. And if it doesn't match, if the voice in your head is not matching people you trust in the environment, you throw it out. You roll up the newspaper and you slap it on the nose like a naughty dog. Is it cruel? This is a really important one. People misunderstand with feedback because oftentimes you and I both, we've had feedback that really hurt, right? We're disappointed in ourselves. We're disappointed in the outcome. And the feedback has been specific and useful, but painful. And feedback can be painful, but you know what feedback never is? Cruel. It's never cruel. If that voice in your head that telling you you're no good, telling you you're a fraud, that's just cruel. And if it's cruel, no other question matters because feedback is never cruel. Don't let anybody, any leader, any friend, any partner ever tell you that feedback can be cruel because it cannot. Feedback can hurt. You know that thing that happens, and I had it happen to me on holiday a couple of years ago, when my good friend Chris, she was like, nope, don't wear that. We were going out. I'm clearly not much of a partier, but we were going out to this thing at night, and I wore what I thought would be cool, and I forgot that I was 50. And she was just like, no, you can't wear that. And it really hurt because I thought I looked okay, and I did not. I've seen the picture she took. The difference was that feedback was designed to avoid my humiliation. It was designed to make sure that I gave the very best impression of me. And whilst it hurt, it was the opposite of cruel. Don't let people be cruel, and don't let them pretend that cruelty is feedback. And for you who are leaders in this room, we see you. Don't ever make the excuse that feedback is supposed to be cruel. There is a useful process if you really want to get into critique, and this critique will help you get a more objective view of your plans and how you're delivering on your own promise, right? On your own potential. And that's to ask a few questions, well, a couple of questions, and then consider some actions. The first question that we ask, my team and I do this for everything. So when they get to see this video, we will go through this process with them, and they will tell me feedback that might be harsh, but it'll be really fair and it'll make me better. The first question is this: what went well? Specifically and objectively, what went well in the thing that you're discussing? You just did X. You went for an interview. You presented in front of your team. You met a new client, whatever it is. What went well? Be specific and be objective. Even better if, on reflection, had I done this and that, the outcome might have been even better. And you think of 4, 5, 6 things that are even better. And as you think of the things that went well, and as you think of the things that would be even better if, you then think, what have I learned from this? What have I learned from what I've just done in terms of what I want to do in the future, in terms of how I can get better? And are there any actions from it? Maybe you say, you know what, I put an hour in of preparation for this, and I honestly think that if I'd have just put an hour in, then maybe got some feedback and then come back another 15 minutes, it would have been better. There's some learnings and there's some action for next time. This is a useful way to help eliminate some of those feelings of being a fraud, because when you're that thorough, frauds don't pass muster, and you're not a fraud. One of the things that happens with imposter syndrome is you start to think that your confidence doesn't really exist, that your self-esteem is evaporating. I know that feeling. I know it doesn't seem like it, perhaps because I'm talking to you here and I know there's tons of people over there, but I'm an introvert. I'm an extreme introvert, and I have crisis of confidence just like everybody else. I just need you to know this. There's nothing intrinsically great about universal high self-esteem. Almost every sociopath we've ever caught and put into prison has had very high self-esteem. It's not intrinsically a good thing. It's not one of those things where the more you have of it, the better you are. There's probably a sweet spot. where some doubt ameliorates some confidence, stops us from doing stupid or reckless things. But also the thing to remember is that your self-esteem is domain specific. You don't just have a self-esteem. You don't just have high self-esteem or low self-esteem. I had higher self-esteem if I'm talking about psychology and much lower self-esteem if I'm talking about technology, because I just don't know what many of you might know about it. High self-esteem in certain areas where I feel like I've got a good understanding, and lower in others. And one of the things that we can do is map where we have kind of a better sense of ourselves in terms of our self-esteem. Where do we really feel a sense of confidence, and where do we not, and why? Why in this area do we feel confident? And maybe it's because, and many people will find as you map this, you've just got a better understanding. You've got a better understanding of your own, an objectively better understanding of your own skills. And that makes a difference. Having an objective understanding of yourself won't eliminate imposter syndrome, but it gives your mind more of a foundation in reality, so that when that voice in your head, or indeed other people outside, start to tell you you're no good at this, you're no good at that, you can ignore it a little more, because you've got this better personal insight and a more explicit self-knowledge. Knowing yourself is the key. It's a key to moderating imposter syndrome, especially if you are one of those people who's setting out to do something extraordinary. And when I say that, know this: I don't know what your extraordinary is. I'm not talking about the kind of the heights of business or the heights of technology. It's not about that. It's about the distance from where you are. For some people, getting from the base of the mountain to a certain height is that extraordinary. For others, it's getting a little bit further up. For each of you, it'll be something different. I started off in my first career as an athlete, kind of. I played basketball. I was never really an athlete, but I certainly played basketball. And when I first started off, I knew nothing about myself, except that I was the clever boy who liked pie and read books. And then I learned about basketball, and I didn't want to play basketball for money or for fame or for any of that other stuff. I just wanted to play because it was the first environment that I ever stood in, surrounded by other people who, when I looked in their faces, all I could see reflecting back was my potential. Nobody was scared. Nobody ran away. Nobody laughed. Nobody pointed. And that's what made me realize I would never leave that. And the reason I wanted to go to America is because all I knew of America at that time as a 17-year-old was that the sun always shined. I was like, well, if I can have this environment and the sun shines, so be it. That was why my first session on court, my first practice of 45 minutes at a little community college gym in Manchester, I told my teammates, my brand new teammates, that I would play in the NBA. You know what they said? Of course. It's remarkable what happens when you find people who are willing to hold you to your potential rather than make you feel like you don't belong, like you're an imposter. Find some of those people. After I'd been playing for a little bit, I wanted to tell my mother that I was not going to be a psychologist straight away, but I was going to do it later, because first I was going to play basketball in the NBA. And I remember waiting until it was one night she was lying in bed listening to the Archers. For those of you who aren't in England, it's a radio kind of play that's been going on for decades. She was listening to the Archers on the radio in the dark, trying to relax. And I walked in the door, and I walked to the window because the light, the amber light of the streets was looking, kind of peering in. And I stood there because I like a bit of drama. And I kind of sat in the windowsill with the light illuminating half my face because I thought it looked impressive. And I told my mother that I didn't know where I wanted to go to university. That was how I was going to start this, because I was planning to go to Leeds to study psychology. She said, well, there's London. And then I just blurted it out. I'm going to play basketball in the NBA. And I could just see her eyes flicker in the night. And so I said, and I'll buy you a house when I make it, because I thought that would sweeten the deal. And she was silent for a while. Then she kind of rolled over, turned off the radio. She sat up in her bed and she said, would you recognize your soul in the dark? I was so frustrated. I just told her I was going to play in the NBA. Now she's talking about soul in the dark. We don't even go to church. And what was really interesting is she was like, most people spend their entire life thinking about what they want to do, and they spend absolutely no time discovering who they are. And we went through this process, and we don't have time to go through it now, but we went through this process where we really started to examine who I was, what makes me tick, what are the things that I stand for, what are the things I won't stand for. What are the things that are my characteristics that will help me? What are the things that might trip me up? And by the time I left for America, a few months later, to go to Toledo, Ohio, to high school for 1 year, I really had a solid understanding of myself. And so even though I stood surrounded again in America by people who looked at me as if I had potential, but also skeptical because I'm this British kid trying to make it, I had enough of a foundation in who I was that the doubts, well, they didn't stay away, but they didn't stop me. Spend some time learning who you are. It makes a difference. I've taught to you a little bit, and I'm going to shut up in a minute so that you guys can ask some questions. So just to let everybody know, in the background, I'll be taking some questions in a moment. One of the things that you can do that makes a difference, I've been talking a lot about identity and this reflecting back potential, and that some of you have people around you, perhaps, who are not so useful in that reflection. But what you can do is create what I call a cabinet. The idea of a cabinet is pretty smart, right? Mostly in politics, it's not done very well. It seems that it's not just about picking the best people, it's about picking sycophants. But I'm talking about building a cabinet at its best, right? And that is a group of people who you are going to define the expectations of. You're going to ask people what you can always rely on from them to give them this robust, honest, objective feedback. And you're going to find people with different perspectives, so their different mirrors can reflect back different angles, different parts of your potential, and indeed highlight different parts of what might challenge you. I always think it's important to find someone older and unrelated to you who's got some experience in the workplace, someone older, perhaps who's retired, who's seen it all, someone younger. Really important to get a perspective. Even if you are yourself quite a young person, find someone else. It's always interesting what happens, how much you learn when you are the leader in the dyad. Find someone related to you who loves you, someone unrelated to you who loves you. Find someone at a similar stage as you who's trying to achieve something similar to you, and someone at a similar stage to you who's trying to achieve something quite remarkably different. Doing this creates a group of people, and you never have to actually all meet together. But the idea is that you recognize that mutually you are going to be for each other that objective mirror that holds up your perspective, their potential, and holds them to it. This doesn't have to be onerous. You don't have to contact them every 5 minutes. But what you do have is when you have those moments of doubt, when that voice is ringing, especially loud in your head, you can look through a list of people and get 1 or 2 impressions that help you once again feel like your feet are on the ground, your hands are at the tiller, and you know who you are. It makes such a radical difference. I am so fortunate the cabinet I have is remarkable. They are energy expensive because it's a mutual investment, and boy, is it worth it. Find your cabinet. They'll evolve. People will move in and they'll move out as you grow. But find somebody. The last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to properly turn it over to your questions. One of the things that imposter syndrome does is it spoils your success. It's like somebody's put a speck of dirt in your ice cream. Somebody's poured vinegar in your cream. You've got to embrace your successes and your achievements, earned and assisted. So the ones that you've done all on your own and the things that you've contributed to, you've got to. Imposter syndrome tries to take that pleasure away because it knows that when it takes that pleasure away, your motivation dips. Because nobody can strive forever without feeling some sense of joy. Imposter syndrome and that voice in your head, it wants to yuck your yum, and you can't let them. Don't avoid praise. I know many of you with imposter syndrome, you'll do that thing that you think is polite and demure. You'll be like, oh, well, yeah, you know, lots of people contributed. I don't know. It wasn't really that good. Stop it. That's the voice in your head again. When somebody says, this specific thing, you did this well, because feedback is specific. When somebody says that to you, your answer is thank you. I appreciate that, and I'll remember it. When you do that, it means you aren't being a jerk, because when people praise you specifically and you reject it, it feels like you're being a jerk. Don't do that. But also, if you do that in that moment, it reduces the chance that you'll minimize that achievement later. This makes a difference. So we are going to go to the live Q&A. I was signaling it, and then we'll take the first question as it comes, however it comes. Really happy for it. Oh, that's very small. I'll have to make this bigger. Let me see. Here we go. You mentioned at the beginning that imposter syndrome and low self-esteem are not necessarily synonyms. Sorry. I always thought they basically meant the same thing. Could you elaborate the difference? Yeah. So it's not that imposter syndrome imposter syndrome diminishes or can diminish your self-esteem. It can make you feel less, because imagine, you know, that last thing that I said, for example, when your achievements, you start to minimize your own achievements. You can imagine that if you minimize your own achievements, your sense of achievement, your sense of motivation, and indeed your sense of self-esteem will drop. So imposter syndrome has a toxic effect on self-esteem. But I think what people think is that to have imposter syndrome, you must have weak self-esteem in the first place. And that is not the case. Many of you, bright, brilliant, different, I hope a little bit weird, because the world needs that. Just because you're bright, brilliant, and a little bit different, and maybe a little weird like me, imposter syndrome will try and diminish your self-esteem, because by doing that, you're less likely to thrive, to succeed, to be embraced and change the status quo. Just remember, you're not broken. If you feel imposter syndrome, the thing that we know for sure about you is that you care about achievement. That's a good thing. Now we just need to use some of the tools, hopefully, that I told you that were useful in getting rid of that. Should we take another one? Any tips on how to distinguish imposter syndrome from actually being in the wrong place, job at the wrong time? It's a difficult one. That's a difficult one. I think, sorry for the noise in the background, central London during lockdown, everybody apparently screaming in the middle of my courtyard is the way forward. Distinguish imposter syndrome from actually being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So this is where the cabinet comes in handy. This is where the cabinet comes in handy. Because sometimes, I think the point that's being made there is sometimes you feel like you can't trust your own judgment. Even if you've got a bit more of a foundation, even if you're being more objective, even if you're challenging that voice in your head, you worry that you're not being objective and you can't tell the difference between whether this environment is really toxic for you or whether you're just not good enough for this environment. And that's where your cabinet can help. That's where talking to the people who you know are sworn to give you an objective judgment about you can really pay dividends. Use your cabinet. And not just one of them. Don't just always pick your mum. If my mum was still alive, I'd probably pick my mum all the time. Pick more people than that. Next one. Sorry, I must have answered that one too quickly. Is there another one coming in, or? Oh, here we go. HBR study showed that networking can be especially challenging for professionals of color who may not only experience general discomfort, but not being perceived as powerful, credible, or resourceful. Yeah. I mean, it's more of a comment than a question, but it absolutely is true. I know I dread being in environments where I have to constantly work to prove that I'm not the monster that people think I am. In fact, everything you're looking at right now is curated to make me hopefully look as acceptable and clever and non-threatening as possible. I'm wearing a sweater, goodness sake. My glasses, my geekery and my geekery and yodery over here, all of that stuff. Sometimes networking is going to be hard, but none of you, imposter syndrome or not, none of you have chosen a life that is about looking for the easy path. You're not here today. You're not part of this program because you want an easy life. You have ambition and you have drive, and you're concerned that imposter syndrome is going to get in the way. You have never shied away from discomfort in the past. I look at everything that I do that I think will be challenging, and I tie it to my target, to my goal that I have in my head. I know what I want to achieve. I know what my organization will look like. I know the kind of interesting work we're doing. I don't know the faces of the people who will be my colleagues, but I know they'll be passionate and driven and ambitious and wonderful and weird. And so when it comes to networking or something else that I find challenging, I just remember that doing this hard thing gets me that brilliant thing. It helps me. Should we try the next one? I have the overwhelming sense, Naomi, for sure. I have the overwhelming sense that I carry the burden of representing my community in these spaces. I feel that my role is to change perceptions. How can I get past this? Naomi, you speak for us. Those of you who perhaps are a bit more perceived as the norm, and certainly if you're a white person, you won't have had this experience, even if you are different and diverse. I listen to the news sometimes while I'm doing other stuff around the kitchen, and if I hear a story of something terrible that's happened, I always stop what I'm doing and I look at the TV and I bite my lip and I'm like, please let this not be a black or brown person. Because I know that when a black or brown person does something terrible or heinous, all of us are tarnished in a way that when a white person does a crime, all white people are not. So what Naomi is referring to there is real. I don't know if I have good advice for you. You are our representative. You are the representative for people who are like you. If you are conscientious, if you are kind, then I'm good with that. You're going to make mistakes and people will judge, but that's the best we can do. I think I'm supposed to tell you that you don't have to, just shake it off, but it's not true. I'm aware that every time my face appears on anything, that I am speaking for, or at least other people will believe that I am speaking and representing black people, geeks and nerds, Star Wars fans, some part of the LGBT community, just because of who I am. You're ambitious, you're driven, you wouldn't be here if you weren't. Don't carry the weight of an entire group of people on your shoulders. Just know that when you behave with good conscience, when you act with goodwill, when you are kind, you lift us all. When you make a mistake, everybody makes a mistake. But when you get it right, you lift us all, Naomi. Should we have another question? It sounds like, this is Alan, sounds like imposter syndrome, self-imposed, is influenced by unconscious bias imposed by society, the archetype thing. How can we help one change the other? So if you'd keep that question up just for a second so I can read it and continue to mull. So imposter syndrome, again, I don't know if self-imposed is quite fair, because human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to our environment. We can tell what people think about us. And so it is influenced by our environment. And then we internalize that. And that's the monster in our head, I think. That's the homunculus in our head with that horrible nagging voice that tells us we're not good enough, or we're frauds, or we're just lucky in this occasion, and diminishes our joy and pleasure. How can we influence the unconscious bias, the bias, it's not really unconscious, the bias that's imposed by society? Some of it's really practical and boring. Thank you for keeping that up for a bit. Some of it's really practical and boring, right? Some of it is things like, let's rethink what we call our picture of talent. Let's redraw our job descriptions so that we don't have the same kind of messaging that tell the words that tell women this is not for them, or the words that tell Black people this is not for them, the words that tell introverts this is not for them. Rethink that based on the idea that we have a new world coming with new jobs, new roles, and new needs that can't be fulfilled by what came before. I'm not sure that we can do anything quick to get rid of bias in people's minds, but every single workplace, while they can't control what people think, they can control what people say and do. And that is what we do every day in our workplace. We control how we answer the phone. And if we control how we answer the phone, if we can control the process with our clients, then it's not ridiculous to ask that regardless of what you think, whether you're a white supremacist or whether you are somebody else on the other side, that you don't express those views at work. And you create systems that get rid of that subjectivity. I don't think we can change how people think, but we can. There's an amazing woman called Anne-Marie Imafidon. I encourage you to look her up. She got her doctorate at a ridiculously young age. It's embarrassing. She's just brilliant. And she has this organization called the STEMET. She does brilliant work. And she always says, it's not about the individual. Stop focusing there. Focus on the infrastructure. Change the infrastructure, change structure, change society. I think it's the best we can do. It's unsatisfying, I know. Should we take the next one? Since imposter syndrome seems to be related to systemic issues, are there workplaces doing well to combat it, and what are they doing? This is the first time I have ever been asked to talk about imposter syndrome. I talk to workplaces, even today, I have talked to 4 different workplaces. I talk to people all the time about lots of different things, leadership, culture, training. This is the first time I've ever been asked to talk about imposter syndrome, ever. I don't think workplaces, I think workplaces think it's an individual pathology. Oh, it's you, John. Come on now, just buck your ideas up, right? Everything's fair here. You've got to get a fair shake. Just suck it up. I honestly think that's the approach that workplaces take, rather than understanding that it is subtle but significant messages that are sent by individual people in the workplace, by some of the processes, by some of the language used in our websites, in our communications, that makes it clear that some people should feel like imposters while others do not. And I think because of that reason, workplaces think it's your problem to solve. I'm hoping that conversations like this will convince them otherwise. Go ahead, next up. We all perform a balancing act of humbleness and showing off. Do you think the struggle has an effect on imposter syndrome? Yeah, I do. So I don't do humility. That may be evident from listening to me right now. And just stay with me on this, right? Because I'm not talking about being a braggart. I'm not talking about showing off, as Stefan mentions there. I don't encourage anything that enables you to lie to yourself. If you are good at something, I need you to be able to say that you are good at something. And I don't mean that thing where people walk around the office beating their chest saying, yeah, or virtual office, saying, yeah, I'm great. I'm so great. I'm great at everything. That's bragging. That, to Stefan's point, is showing off. But what you can do, a really acute assessment of what you're good at is really important. Don't pretend. Don't lie. about the things that you are gifted at. And it doesn't matter if you're gifted because you worked on it or you're gifted because it just is who you are. You've just got a magnificent brain. Don't lie about it. Too much of humility to me is the idea that in order to avoid offending people whose brilliance in your particular domain does not match, you pretend that you don't have it. That is in service to imposter syndrome, and we cannot do that. I want each one of you to write down what you are bloody brilliant at. Make a list. And I don't just mean, don't do generic, be really specific. Let's talk about the things that you are brilliant at. I want to see your lists. Write lists of the things that you're brilliant at. Don't just do it off the top of your head. Spend some time. Dedicate a couple of hours a week for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Keep revisiting it, coming back to it. If you had a picture of all the stuff you're brilliant at, I'm not saying you then have to go around wearing this thing like a badge on your chest. Oh, these are the 15 or 50 elements that I'm brilliant at. What about you? I'm not saying you do that. But that's a list you should have pinned up somewhere. Because that's the list that's going to help you when that voice in your head starts to try and tell you you're not good at something that you've already identified you're brilliant at. Or when that colleague tells you you're not good at, despite the fact that you know you are. It's important. Go ahead, next one. Would you, oh, this is Google Videos, okay, hello. Would you recommend working with a career coach or therapist to support developing this positive mindset of inclusion and accomplishment? I always recommend. So I'm a psychologist. I used to be a marriage and family therapist. Yes, I recommend therapy, and yes, I recommend coaching. These can be of varying levels of quality, and one of the challenges that many of you will face, unfortunately, is that psychology is also not the most diverse environment in the world. I know you're looking at me, and I'm kind of like a Benetton lad all in one, but most psychologists are not. Most psychologists are white women or white men of middle-class origin, and that's who they are. And we're not doing a great job within the profession, but we're working on it. But what that means is that sometimes you'll get a therapist or a coach who doesn't really understand that it's not just about what you're trying to achieve, but it's also about integrating who you are with what you're trying to achieve. Because as a Black woman, and I'm not one, so I don't know for sure, but as a Black woman, I do know you have a different life experience than I do as a Black man. As a gay man who's white, you have a different experience than me as well. And that is part of your journey. And so whoever you choose as a therapist or a coach, ask them the question, whether they understand the nuances of how your identity might intersect with your ambition, how your imposter syndrome might be informed by who you are. If they can't give you a good answer to that, move on. Next one up. Could you mention the different ways we can increase our self-knowledge or know ourselves better? So thank you for that, Tati. My mother did the Soul in the Dark exercise, which has become something that we now do in my organization. And it's not super complex. I'm really happy to share it with you. And I know it'll seem a bit kind of meh when you hear this, but all it is you get people to say, write down on a piece of paper how you would describe yourself. Just write down on a piece of paper how you describe yourself. Just words. And what normally happens is that people write down, and even though I'm going to tell you the reveal on this, you still have to do the whole process, right? Write down, you see mother, father, brother, daughter, son, whatever. Then you see things like the job that they have or the city that they live in or other stuff like that. And then you'll start to see relationships and things that they like and things like peanut butter and anchovies, things that they like and don't like. And then they create this picture. So you have them do that and not take long, just, 3-5 minutes. And then you say to them, all right, let's remove all the relationship stuff. And suddenly you're looking at a piece of paper where you might have nothing left that distinguishes you from the person right next to you who's done it. Because most people look very surface. I'm 6'9", I'm Black, I've got a white beard. They use the descriptors, the physical descriptors, or the relationship to describe who they are. And you take those away, because my mother said, really, really, people who understand themselves, they can recognize their soul in the dark, she said. So, and we're not a religious family. She simply meant they could see the bit that makes them. Right now, the top 8 inches of my head is talking to the top 8 inches of yours. It's our brains communicating. This is just the carrying case. What we need is a description of this. So what I know about me is that I'm a geek and a nerd. I'm intrigued by the new. I am a person who requires purpose and connection, though at the same time, I find people energy expensive. I know that I admire drive and passion. I know that I am scared and distrustful, and a bit more than that, angry at bullies. And this is the kind of detail that fleshes out who I am, to a point where even if you couldn't see that I'm 6'9" and identify me instantly, you would get a sense of me that is really clear. And that's the process I would go through. What are the kind of things that are really meaningful to you? What are the things that really make you, you? Describe them in real detail. Listen to them, understand them. Think about the implications of them for the kind of work you might want to do, for the kind of people you might want to connect with, the kind of life that you're going to find rewarding. Soul in the dark. Give it a go. If you do suffer from imposter syndrome, I know it won't necessarily help for me to keep telling you it's not your fault and that you're not broken, but it's not your fault and you're not broken. I hope you've really heard me when I said imposter syndrome is something that happens because you care. Hold on to that. That's important. You feel this way because what you're doing matters to you. Employers out there need to recognize that people with imposter syndrome are some of the people they need to keep around, not some of the people they want to leave. And if you are in an environment where you are having this allergic reaction to the toxins around you, make sure you identify what those toxins are. You won't always be able to avoid them, but it helps to know when someone's trying to poison you. And you look at that person and their face tells you that they don't think you're competent. When that person sticks you on the bench and doesn't give you an opportunity or gives you the dog's body work, remember that just because they can't see who you are doesn't mean you aren't brilliant. So I'm going to end and say thank you very much. I really appreciate you joining in. Thanks for the questions. I hope this was useful, and I will see you soon.